Sarah Martinez had always been different from other girls in her neighborhood. Growing up in Detroit's rough East Side, she learned early that survival meant being tougher than the streets that raised her. At 25, she worked as a night security guard at the city's old industrial district, a job most people wouldn't dare take. But Sarah wasn't most people. The autumn of 2019 brought an unusual chill to Detroit. Strange things had been happening around the city, people disappearing without a trace, bizarre animal attacks reported in the news, and whispers of something dark moving through the shadows. Sarah had dismissed most of it as urban legends until she started noticing peculiar patterns during her night shifts. Marcus Thompson, her supervisor and longtime friend, had been acting strangely for weeks. The man who once joked around and shared coffee during their overlapping shifts now avoided eye contact and seemed jumpy whenever she approached. His skin had grown pale, almost translucent, and dark circles rimmed his eyes like he hadn't slept in months. "You look terrible, Marcus," Sarah had told him one evening as they met at the security office. "When's the last time you went to a doctor?" Marcus had laughed, but it sounded hollow and forced. "Just been working too many night shifts, you know how it is." He turned away quickly, but not before Sarah caught something unsettling in his expression, a hunger that made her stomach turn. The warehouse district where Sarah worked stretched for miles along the Detroit River. Abandoned factories and empty lots created a maze of shadows perfect for hiding secrets. During her rounds, she'd started carrying more than the standard security equipment: a military-grade flashlight, pepper spray, and something her grandfather had given her before he died, a silver cross that had belonged to his grandmother in Romania. On the night of October 15th, Sarah arrived at work to find the main security office empty. Marcus's jacket hung on his chair, still warm, with his half-finished coffee steaming on the desk. His radio crackled with static, and the security monitors flickered between different camera feeds showing empty corridors and loading docks. "Marcus?" she called out, her voice echoing in the silence. No response. Sarah checked the logbook. Marcus had signed in at 10 p.m., just 30 minutes before her arrival. According to the cameras, he'd made his first round at 10:15 p.m., checking the perimeter of Building C, the oldest structure in the complex. After that, nothing. She grabbed her equipment and headed toward Building C, her footsteps echoing against the concrete. The October wind howled through broken windows, carrying with it the smell of rust and something else, something metallic that reminded her of blood. Building C had been abandoned since the 1970s, when the automotive plant that once operated there moved operations overseas. Now it stood as a hollow monument to Detroit's industrial past, its broken windows like empty eye sockets staring out into the night. Sarah had always avoided extended patrols in this section, but tonight she had no choice. As she approached the building's main entrance, her flashlight beam caught something that made her freeze. Fresh footprints in the dust led from the doorway deeper into the building. But they weren't alone. Alongside Marcus's familiar work boots were other prints, bare feet that seemed too long and narrow to be human. Sarah's hand instinctively moved to the cross at her throat. Her grandfather's stories suddenly didn't seem so far-fetched. He'd told her about things that hunted in the darkness, creatures that looked human but fed on blood and fear. She'd always assumed they were just old country superstitions, tales meant to keep children from wandering at night. The building's interior was a maze of rusted machinery and collapsed sections of flooring. Water dripped steadily from damaged pipes, creating an irregular rhythm that seemed to follow Sarah as she moved deeper into the structure. Her radio hissed with static, unable to reach the main office through the building's steel frame. 20 minutes into her search, she heard voices coming from the building's lower level. One was definitely Marcus, but his tone was different, subservient, almost pleading. The other voice was unfamiliar, cold and commanding, with an accent she couldn't place. Sarah found a stairwell that led to the basement level. The voices grew clearer as she descended, and she could make out words that made her blood run cold. "The transformation is nearly complete," the strange voice was saying. "Soon you'll understand the gift I've given you, Marcus. The hunger will become natural, purposeful." I don't want this, Marcus replied, his voice breaking. Please, just let me go back to my life. Laughter echoed through the basement, cruel and ancient. Your old life is over. You belong to me now, as do all my children. Speaking of which, I smell someone else in my domain. Someone with interesting blood. Sarah's heart pounded as she realized they knew she was there. She reached for her radio, hoping to call for backup, but remembered it wouldn't work in the basement. Her only options were to run or face whatever was down there with Marcus. She thought about her friend, trapped and pleading for freedom, and made her choice. The basement opened into a large chamber that had once housed the plant's main boiler system. Now the massive machinery stood silent and rusted, creating perfect hiding spots in the shadows. Emergency lighting cast an eerie red glow across the space, and in that crimson illumination, Sarah saw something that challenged everything she thought she knew about reality. Marcus stood in the center of the room, but he looked nothing like the man she'd worked with for 3 years. His skin was pale as paper, his fingernails had grown into claws, and when he turned toward her approach, she saw fangs where his canine teeth should have been. Beside him stood a figure that radiated authority and malevolence. The man, if he could be called that, appeared to be in his 30s, with dark hair and sharp features that might have been handsome in different circumstances. His clothes looked expensive but timeless, as if they belonged to another century. When he smiled at Sarah's arrival, his teeth gleamed like ivory daggers in the red light. "Welcome," the figure said, his accent definitely European, possibly Romanian. "I am Victor Castellane, and you have the honor of witnessing a rebirth. Your friend Marcus is becoming something far greater than he ever was as a mortal." Sarah's hand closed around her grandfather's cross, feeling its silver warmth against her palm. "Let him go," she said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. Victor's laugh was like breaking glass. "Let him go? My dear girl, he came to me willingly. The loneliness of night shifts, the isolation, the growing disconnection from the daylight world, it all led him to seek something more. I simply provided it." "That's not true," Marcus said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I never asked for this." "Didn't you?" Victor moved with fluid grace, circling Marcus like a predator. "Every night you wished for something to break the monotony, something to make you feel alive again. I heard those wishes, and I answered them." Dan Sarah stepped further into the chamber, her eyes adjusting to the red lighting. She could see other figures in the shadows, at least 3 more people who shared Marcus's pale complexion and predatory stance. They watched her with hungry eyes, waiting for Victor's command. "How many others?" she asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. "Detroit has been very welcoming," Victor replied. "The economic hardship, the population decline, the abandoned buildings, it's created the perfect environment for my kind to thrive. We've been building a new family here, one that will eventually spread beyond this dying city. Trust Teddy." Sarah's mind raced. The disappearances, the animal attacks, the strange reports in the news. It all made sense now. Victor wasn't just creating individual vampires, he was building an army. "The authorities will notice eventually," she said, trying to buy time while she figured out her next move. "Will they?" Victor's smile widened. "The police are already overwhelmed with gang violence and drug crimes. A few more missing persons reports won't raise any flags, especially when they involve society's forgotten people. The homeless, the addicts, the night shift workers who have no one to miss them." The casual cruelty in his words sparked anger in Sarah's chest. These weren't just random victims. They were people with lives and families and dreams, reduced to nothing more than recruitment opportunities for a monster's ambition. "You're wrong about that," she said, pulling out her phone. "People will miss them. People will look for them." Victor moved faster than her eyes could follow, suddenly standing directly in front of her. The phone flew from her hand, clattering across the concrete floor. His presence was overwhelming. The scent of old blood and decay, the unnatural coldness that seemed to radiate from his skin, and eyes that held centuries of predatory experience. "Brave little girl," he whispered, his breath cold against her face. "But, ultimately, foolish. You could have lived if you'd simply turned around and walked away. Now you've seen too much, learned too much. I can't allow you to leave." Sarah's fingers tightened around the silver cross. "Maybe I don't want to leave. Maybe I want to stop you." Victor's expression shifted from amusement to surprise, then to something resembling respect. "Interesting. Tell me, what makes you think you could stand against someone who has walked this earth for over 4 centuries? "Because someone has to," Sarah replied simply. The truth was, she was terrified. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to get as far away from this nightmare as possible. But looking at Marcus, seeing what had been done to him and imagining it happening to countless others, she knew she couldn't live with herself if she walked away. Victor studied her for a long moment, then stepped back with a flourish. "Very well. I appreciate courage, even when it's misguided. I'll give you a chance, not to escape, but to die with dignity. If by some miracle you succeed, my children will let you leave this place. When you fail, which you will, you'll join our family willingly. And if I refuse, then my children will hunt you through these tunnels for sport, and your death will be neither quick nor pleasant." Sarah looked around the chamber at the pale faces watching her from the shadows. She counted at least 5 vampires besides Victor, all of them younger and less experienced than their master, but still possessing supernatural speed and strength. Even if she somehow managed to defeat Victor, the others would likely tear her apart. But she'd made her choice the moment she decided to come looking for Marcus. "I accept," she said, removing her security belt and letting it fall to the floor. She kept only her flashlight and her grandfather's cross, feeling its weight in her palm like a talisman. Victor nodded approvingly. "Weapons? Just what I have. Then, let us begin." The vampire lord shed his expensive jacket, revealing a lean but powerful frame beneath his white dress shirt. When he moved into a fighting stance, Sarah could see the predatory grace that came from centuries of hunting and killing. Every movement was economical, purposeful, designed for maximum efficiency in taking down prey. Sarah had trained in self-defense throughout her teens and 20s, spending hours at the local gym learning boxing and martial arts. She'd always been naturally athletic, with quick reflexes and good instincts, but she'd never faced anything like this. Victor attacked without warning, moving like liquid shadow across the chamber floor. Sarah barely had time to raise her arms in defense before his fist connected with her shoulder, sending her spinning into one of the rusted boiler pipes. The impact knocked the wind from her lungs and sent stars dancing across her vision. "Too slow," Victor commented, already repositioning for his next attack. Sarah rolled away just as his foot slammed into the concrete where her head had been a moment before. She came up swinging her flashlight like a club, but Victor caught her wrist effortlessly and twisted until she dropped the light. His other hand shot toward her throat, and only her quick reflexes saved her from having her neck snapped. She ducked under his reaching fingers and drove her knee upward, aiming for his solar plexus. The blow connected solidly, but Victor barely seemed to notice. He backhanded her across the face, and Sarah tasted blood as she stumbled backward. "Why? Is this your best effort?" Victor asked, circling her slowly. "I'm disappointed. I expected more from someone brave enough to challenge me." Sarah wiped blood from her split lip and tried to think. Strength and speed weren't going to win this fight. Victor had too many advantages in those areas. She needed to be smarter, to use his confidence against him. "You're right," she said, straightening up and trying to look defeated. "This was stupid. We can't beat you." Victor's smile widened. "Finally, some sense. Kneel, and I'll make your transformation as painless as possible." Instead of kneeling, Sarah lunged forward, not at Victor but toward Marcus. Her sudden movement caught everyone off guard. and she managed to grab her friend's arm before Victor could react. "Marcus," she shouted, looking directly into his changed features. "Remember who you are! Remember your life before this." For a moment, confusion flickered across Marcus's face. The predatory hunger faded from his eyes, replaced by recognition and horror at what he'd become. "Sarah!" he whispered. "What have I done?" Victor snarled and moved to separate them, but Marcus suddenly stepped between them, his newfound vampire strength finally used for protection instead of predation. "No," Marcus said firmly. "I won't let you hurt her." "You forget yourself, child," Victor hissed. "You belong to me. I belong to no one," Marcus replied. And for the first time since Sarah had found him, he sounded like his old self. The rebellion of his newest creation clearly enraged Victor. His civilized facade cracked, revealing the monster beneath. His fingernails extended into razor-sharp claws, his canine teeth elongated into fangs, and his eyes began to glow with an unholy red light. "Then you'll both die," he growled, his voice distorting into something barely human. What happened next would replay in Sarah's memory for the rest of her life. Victor launched himself at them with inhuman speed, claws extended and fangs bared. Marcus tried to intercept him, but the older vampire's experience showed he feinted left, then struck right, his claws raking across Marcus's chest and sending him crashing into the wall. As Victor turned toward Sarah, she made the desperate decision that would define everything that followed. Her grandfather's cross was still in her hand, its silver surface warm to the touch. Without thinking, she raised it between them like a shield. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Victor's momentum carried him forward, but as soon as the silver cross came within inches of his skin, he screamed and recoiled as if he'd been burned. Smoke rose from his face where the cross had nearly touched him, and the smell of burning flesh filled the air. "Impossible!" he gasped, staring at the cross in disbelief. "That's just superstition, old wives' tales." But the evidence was clear. The cross had power against him, though Sarah didn't understand why or how. She pressed her advantage, stepping forward with the cross extended. Victor backed away, his other vampires moving restlessly in the shadows, but not daring to interfere. "Let us go," Sarah demanded. "Release Marcus from whatever hold you have on him, and let us leave." Victor's burned face twisted with rage and humiliation. "You think one small victory makes you my equal? I have powers you can't imagine, resources you can't comprehend. Even if you escape tonight, I'll find you. I'll hunt everyone you care about. I'll make you watch as I turn them one by one." "Then I guess I'll have to make sure you don't get the chance," Sarah replied. She advanced another step, and Victor retreated further, but she could see him calculating, looking for an opening. The cross was powerful, but it wasn't unlimited in its protection. Eventually, she'd make a mistake or tire, and he'd strike. Behind her, she heard Marcus getting back to his feet. Blood seeped from the claw marks across his chest, but he was healing with supernatural speed. "Sarah," he said quietly, "there are too many of them. Even if you can hold Victor off, the others will attack." She knew he was right. Already, the other vampires were beginning to circle, staying just outside the cross's apparent range, but positioning themselves for a coordinated assault. "Can you fight?" she asked Marcus, not taking her eyes off Victor. "I can try. This hunger, it's hard to control, but I remember who I am now. I remember my choice. Dash. Dash, dash. Sarah made a decision that went against every survival instinct she possessed. Instead of continuing to back toward the exit, she moved deeper into the chamber, toward the cluster of rusted boiler equipment. "What are you doing?" Victor demanded, following her but maintaining his distance from the cross. "Something stupid, probably," Sarah admitted. She'd noticed something during their fight that Victor had missed. The basement's emergency lighting system was old and poorly maintained. Exposed electrical conduits ran along the ceiling, many of them corroded and sparking intermittently. If she could find a way to disrupt the power distribution, Sarah reached the main electrical panel, its ancient switches and breakers protected by a rusted metal cover. She looked back at Victor, who was watching her with growing suspicion. "Stay back," she warned, raising the cross. "I mean it," Victor laughed. "What do you think you're going to accomplish? Cut the lights and stumble around in the dark with creatures who can see perfectly? That's your master plan?" "Not exactly," Sarah said, and smashed the cross against the electrical panel's cover. The impact sent sparks flying and several of the exposed conduits began arcing wildly. But more importantly, the silver cross had conducted enough electrical current to superheat itself. When Sarah pulled it back, the metal was glowing white-hot. Victor's eyes widened as he understood what she intended. "You're insane," he breathed. "That will kill you, too." "Maybe," Sarah agreed, "but at least it'll stop you from hurting anyone else." She pressed the superheated cross against the main power line, and the basement exploded into chaos. Electrical fire raced along the conduits, showering sparks down on everyone in the chamber. The emergency lighting failed, plunging them into near-complete darkness. But the real danger came from the water that had been dripping from the damaged pipes above, water that was now conducting thousands of volts of electricity across the flooded concrete floor. Victor screamed as the electrical current hit him, his supernatural resilience no match for raw voltage. The other vampires scattered, some trying to climb the walls to avoid the electrified floor, others simply fleeing toward the exits. In the chaos and darkness, Sarah lost track of Victor. She could hear him cursing in languages she didn't recognize, but the sound was moving away from her, toward the far end of the chamber. "Marcus!" she called out. "Where are you?" "Here," his voice came from near the stairs. "Sarah, we need to get out of here. The whole electrical system is overloading." She could see what he meant. Fires were starting throughout the basement as overloaded circuits sparked and caught on dried debris. Soon, the whole building would be ablaze. Sarah picked her way carefully across the chamber, using her phone's flashlight to navigate around the worst of the electrical hazards. The cross had cooled enough to handle safely, though it was still too hot to put back in her pocket. She found Marcus waiting at the base of the stairs, his pale features visible in the glow from the spreading fires. "Are you all right?" she asked. "I think so. The electricity, it hurt, but not as badly as it seemed to affect Victor and the others." He looked down at his hands, studying the claws that were slowly retracting back to normal fingernails. "I'm different now, but I think I can control it, Teddy." "Can you change back? Can you become human again?" "I don't know. I don't think so. But maybe I don't have to be a monster. Maybe I can choose what to do with what I've become." They climbed the stairs as smoke began to fill the basement behind them. The main floor of the building was already beginning to show signs of the fire below, heat radiating up through the floorboards and a haze of smoke drifting through the broken windows. As they emerged into the Detroit night, Sarah could hear sirens in the distance. Someone had seen the fire and called it in. "What do we tell them?" Marcus asked. Sarah looked at her friend, her changed friend, who was no longer entirely human but was still the person she'd worked alongside for 3 years. "We tell them there was an electrical fire in the basement. We were doing a security check when it happened. That's all they need to know." "And, Victor?" Sarah looked back at the burning building. She hadn't seen the vampire lord escape, but she also hadn't seen his body. Creatures that lived for centuries probably didn't die easily, even from electrocution and fire. "We deal with that when the time comes," she said simply. As the fire trucks arrived and the building continued to burn, Sarah realized her life had changed forever. She'd glimpsed a hidden world of monsters and darkness, and somehow survived an encounter that should have killed her. But more than that, she'd chosen to fight instead of run, to protect instead of preserve herself. Standing there in the cold October night, watching the flames consume the place where Victor had planned to build his army of vampires, Sarah Martinez understood that this was only the beginning. Somewhere out there, other monsters were hunting in the darkness. Other people needed protection. And maybe, just maybe, She was one of the few people who could provide it. The cross her grandfather had given her was still warm in her hand, its silver surface blackened but intact. She thought about his stories, the ones she'd dismissed as superstition. Perhaps it was time to take another look at the old family history to understand exactly what she'd inherited along with the cross. Marcus stood beside her, no longer fully human, but still her friend, still someone worth saving. Together, they watched Victor's stronghold burn, both of them forever changed by what had happened in the darkness below. Neither of them noticed the figure watching from the shadows across the street, pale features illuminated briefly by the firelight before disappearing back into the Detroit night. Victor Castellane was wounded but not defeated, and his plans for the city were far from over. The real battle was just beginning. The hunt begins. 3 weeks after the fire at Building C, Sarah Martinez sat in the Detroit Public Library's main branch, surrounded by stacks of books that most people would consider either outdated folklore or complete fiction. Ancient histories, vampire mythology, religious texts about spiritual warfare, and family genealogies filled the table around her laptop computer. The official investigation into the warehouse fire had concluded it was an electrical accident caused by faulty wiring and poor maintenance. The investigators found no evidence of the bodies she'd expected them to discover, no trace of Victor or his vampire followers. It was as if they'd simply vanished into smoke along with the building's basement level. Marcus had disappeared too, but by choice rather than destruction. The morning after the fire, he'd left a note at her apartment explaining that he needed time to understand what he'd become and learn to control the hunger that now defined his existence. He promised to contact her when he figured out how to live with his transformation without hurting innocent people. Sarah respected his decision, but his absence left her feeling isolated and vulnerable. She was the only witness to what had really happened in that basement, the only person who knew that Victor Castellane was still out there somewhere, probably planning his next move. The research had become her obsession. Every free hour was spent learning about vampires, not the romanticized versions from movies and books, but the real legends that had terrified people for centuries. She'd discovered that her grandfather's stories weren't just Romanian folklore. Elena Santos, the librarian who'd been helping with her research, approached with another stack of books. Elena was in her 50s with graying hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She'd grown up in Mexico before moving to Detroit as a teenager, and her grandmother had told her similar stories about creatures that hunted in the darkness. "I found something interesting," Elena said, setting down a leather-bound journal that looked centuries old. This belonged to a priest named Father Rodriguez who worked in Mexico City during the 1800s. He wrote about encounters with vampires and the methods his family used to fight them. Sarah opened the journal carefully, its pages yellow with age. The writing was in Spanish, but Elena had already translated the relevant sections. According to Father Rodriguez, vampires aren't just random monsters, Elena explained. They're organized, hierarchical. The older ones, the ones who've survived for centuries, they build networks of younger vampires who serve them. But here's the interesting part. They can be tracked. How? Elena pointed to a detailed diagram in the journal. They need to feed regularly, and they tend to hunt in patterns. More importantly, they're territorial. An old vampire like the one you described wouldn't just abandon an area where he'd invested time and resources. He'd relocate, but stay close enough to monitor his former territory and eventually return. Sarah studied the diagram, which showed a map of Mexico City with various locations marked in red ink. These are feeding sites? Exactly. Father Rodriguez tracked vampire activity by mapping disappearances, unexplained deaths, and reports of people acting strangely after surviving attacks. He found that each vampire had a preferred hunting ground, usually a radius of about 10 miles. The implications hit Sarah immediately. If Victor was still in the Detroit area, his feeding pattern would leave traces. Missing persons reports, unexplained deaths, people exhibiting behavior similar to what Marcus had shown before his transformation. "Elena, I need access to police records, missing person reports from the last 3 weeks. Can you help me get that kind of information? That's not something the library can provide directly, but I might know someone who can help. My nephew David works as a detective with the Detroit Police Department. He's open-minded about things that don't fit normal explanations. 2 days later, Sarah found herself sitting in a downtown coffee shop across from Detective David Santos. He was younger than she'd expected, probably in his early 30s, with his aunt's kind eyes but a more skeptical expression. Elena had apparently briefed him on the basics of Sarah's situation, though from his body language he remained unconvinced. "My aunt says you think vampires killed someone you worked with," David said, stirring sugar into his coffee. "I have to tell you, that's not usually where police investigations start." "I know how it sounds," Sarah replied, "but humor me for a minute. Have there been any unusual missing persons cases in the last 3 weeks? People who disappeared without a trace, especially from the night shift community?" David pulled out a tablet and scrolled through several screens. "Actually, yes. 7 people have gone missing since October 15th, which is higher than our usual average. But Detroit has a lot of reasons why people disappear. Drugs, gang violence, economic desperation. What about the demographics? Ages, occupations, when they were last seen? Let me see." David frowned as he reviewed the data. "Okay, this is weird. All 7 were between 25 and 40. All worked night jobs, security guards, hospital staff, factory workers, and they all disappeared between midnight and 4 a.m. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. That's Victor's pattern. He's recruiting again. Victor? The vampire who was building an army in that warehouse basement. He specifically targeted night shift workers because they're isolated, tired, and less likely to be missed immediately. David closed his tablet and leaned back in his chair. "Sarah, I want to help you, but I need more than patterns and theories. Do you have any concrete evidence that these disappearances are connected to your warehouse incident?" The number was unknown, but the message made her blood run cold. "I know what you did to my children. Meet me at the old Michigan Central Station at midnight, or I start killing one of your neighbors every night until you do. Come alone." Sarah showed the message to David, whose skeptical expression shifted to concern. "This could be a prank," he said, though he didn't sound convinced, "or someone trying to manipulate you into a dangerous situation." "It's him," Sarah said with certainty. "Victor survived the fire, and now he wants revenge." Michigan Central Station had been abandoned since 1988, standing as a monument to Detroit's industrial decline. The 18-story building was a popular destination for urban explorers and photographers, but at night it became a different kind of place, dark, isolated, and perfect for the kind of confrontation Victor was proposing. "You can't seriously be considering meeting him," David said. "If I don't, he'll start killing innocent people. You read the message. Then we set up a trap. Bring a full tactical team, surround the building, take him into custody." Sarah shook her head. "Your tactical team wouldn't stand a chance against a centuries-old vampire. They'd just be more victims. But maybe," she paused, an idea forming, "maybe there's another way." That evening, Sarah stood outside the ruins of Michigan Central Station, checking her equipment one final time. She wore a tactical vest borrowed from David's police contacts, with silver crosses sewn into the fabric. Her grandfather's cross hung around her neck, its silver surface polished to a mirror shine. She carried a high-powered flashlight, several bottles of what Elena had assured her was holy water, and a wooden stake carved from ash wood according to Father Rodriguez's specifications. Most importantly, she wasn't alone. David had positioned himself with a sniper rifle on a building across the street, with instructions to shoot Victor if he got the upper hand in their confrontation. Marcus had also returned, appearing at her apartment that afternoon to insist on helping despite the risks to his own safety. "I can sense him," Marcus had explained. "Being what I am now, I can feel other vampires nearby. It's like a constant pressure in the back of my mind. If Victor has others with him, I'll know. As midnight approached, Sarah entered the station through a gap in the boarded-up entrance. The interior was a maze of debris and graffiti, with moonlight streaming through broken windows to create shifting patterns of light and shadow. Her footsteps echoed in the vast space, and somewhere in the darkness ahead, she heard the sound of slow, deliberate clapping. "Magnificent," Victor's voice carried through the ruins. "You actually came. I wasn't certain you possessed that level of courage or foolishness." Sarah followed the sound deeper into the station, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. "Let's get this over with. You want revenge for what happened to your vampire family? Here I am." "Oh, my dear Sarah." Victor stepped into the light, and she saw that the electrical burns on his face had healed completely. He looked exactly as he had before their confrontation, elegant and dangerous in his expensive clothes. Revenge is such a crude motivation. What I want is understanding. Understanding? You destroyed weeks of careful work in a single night. My carefully selected children, my secure base of operations, my plans for expanding throughout Detroit, all of it reduced to ash because of one security guard with a silver cross. Victor circled her slowly, staying just outside her flashlight's range. "I need to know how. I need to know why that trinket had power over me." Sarah kept the cross visible in her free hand, noting how Victor's eyes tracked its movement with a mixture of fear and fascination. "It's not the cross," she said, pieces of her research finally clicking together. "It's me, my family. We're descendants of people who fought your kind before." Victor stopped circling and studied her with new interest. "Explain." "My grandfather's family came from Romania in the 1920s. They weren't running from poverty or looking for opportunity. They were running from you. Or vampires like you. They'd been hunters for generations, passing down knowledge and blessed weapons to fight monsters." Sarah held up the cross. "This isn't just silver. It's been blessed by priests and carried by vampire hunters for over a century. It contains their faith, their determination, their refusal to surrender to darkness." "Impressive," Victor admitted. "But if your family were truly hunters, where are they now? Where is your training, your arsenal of weapons, your network of allies?" It was a fair point. Sarah's grandfather had died when she was 12, taking most of his knowledge with him. Her parents had dismissed his stories as old country superstitions and never passed them on. She was probably the first person in her family line in decades to actually encounter a vampire. "I'm learning," she said simply. "Yes, you are." "Which brings me to my proposition." Sarah tensed, expecting an attack, but Victor remained at a distance. "Join me," he said. "Not as one of my children. You're too valuable for that simple transformation. Join me as a partner. Bring your hunter's knowledge and instincts to serve a greater purpose." "What purpose?" "Order," Victor replied. "Control. You've seen what Detroit has become. Crime, poverty, desperation everywhere you look. The mortal authorities are overwhelmed, ineffective. But my kind could change that. We could bring true law and order to this city. Eliminate the drugs and violence, create a society where people are safe. Safe to be your food supply, you mean? We need to feed, yes. But we could be selective, taking only the worst elements of society. The murderers, the rapists, the dealers who poison children, they could serve a useful purpose for the first time in their miserable lives." Sarah felt the dark appeal of Victor's offer. Detroit did have serious problems that conventional law enforcement couldn't solve, and there was a brutal efficiency to the idea of using vampires to eliminate the worst criminals. But she thought about Marcus, about the horror in his eyes when he realized what he'd become. She thought about the missing night shift workers who'd committed no crimes except being vulnerable and alone. "And who decides who deserves to die?" she asked. "You, your vampire council? What happens when you run out of criminals and start looking at people who are just inconvenient? Such moral complications." Victor sighed. "But you raise valid points. Very well, let me offer you a simpler choice. Walk away. Leave Detroit, start a new life somewhere else, and I'll spare this city my attention. I'll take my remaining children and establish our kingdom elsewhere. And if I refuse? Victor's civilized mask slipped, revealing the predator beneath. Then I'll turn this city into a hunting ground. Every night, my children and I will kill until Detroit is empty or you're dead, starting with everyone you care about. From somewhere in the darkness beyond her flashlight beam, Sarah heard movement. Not just Victor, but others. Marcus had been right. The vampire lord hadn't come alone. How many? She asked quietly. Enough, Victor replied. I've been busy since our last encounter. Detroit has no shortage of desperate people willing to accept transformation if it means escape from their current circumstances. Sarah's radio crackled softly with David's voice. I count at least 6 heat signatures moving around the building's perimeter. You need to get out of there. But running wasn't an option anymore. If Victor had truly built another army of vampires, leaving would just condemn the entire city to become their feeding ground. I have a counter-proposal, Sarah said, pulling out the wooden stake she'd carved according to Father Rodriguez's specifications. Victor laughed. You think you can fight all of us with a piece of wood and an old cross? I think I can fight you, Sarah replied. 1-on-1. If I win, your vampires leave Detroit forever. If you win, you can have the city. And why would I accept such terms when I already have overwhelming superiority? Because you're curious, Sarah said, realizing she'd found Victor's weakness. You want to know how strong I really am, how much of my family's hunting ability I've inherited. You won't get that answer by having your children overwhelm me with numbers. Victor was quiet for a long moment, considering her proposal. Sarah could hear the other vampires moving in the shadows, waiting for his command. Very well, he said finally. But not here. Too many variables, too many opportunities for outside interference. There's a place I know, an old church that was abandoned when the neighborhood emptied out. Consecrated ground. It will limit both our abilities and make the contest more interesting. When? Rust. Now, follow me and come alone. Any sign that you've brought backup and the deal is off. Sarah looked around the ruined station one last time, knowing she was probably about to make the worst decision of her life. But she thought about the 7 missing people, about the thousands of innocent citizens who would suffer if Victor's vampires were allowed to hunt freely through Detroit. She followed him into the night, toward what might be her final confrontation with the darkness that had consumed her city. As they walked through Detroit's empty streets, Victor seemed almost philosophical about their approaching duel. Tell me, he said, what made you choose to fight instead of flee? Most people, when confronted with evidence of vampires, either deny what they've seen or run as far away as possible. Sarah considered the question. My grandfather used to tell me that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's acting in spite of fear because something matters more than your safety. And what matters more to you than your safety? Other people's safety, she said simply. Victor nodded thoughtfully. Noble. Ultimately futile in the long term, but noble. You realize that even if you defeat me tonight, others of my kind will eventually come to Detroit? I'm not the only vampire lord seeking to establish territory in America's declining cities. Then I'll fight them too. With what? Your grandfather's cross and a few weeks of library research? Sarah didn't have a good answer for that. Her crash course in vampire hunting had given her enough knowledge to survive one encounter, but Victor was right. She was nowhere near ready to face a sustained campaign against multiple vampire threats. The abandoned church Victor had chosen stood in what had once been a thriving neighborhood. Now it was surrounded by empty lots and boarded-up houses, a Gothic monument to faith in a landscape of urban decay. The building's stained glass windows were broken or covered with plywood, and its bell tower tilted slightly, as if the whole structure was slowly settling into the earth. Perfect, Victor said, gesturing toward the church. Consecrated ground will prevent either of us from using our full supernatural abilities. The contest will be decided by skill, determination, and faith rather than raw power. As they approached the church's main entrance, Sarah felt something change in the air around her. The cross at her throat grew warm, and she sensed a presence that was neither threatening nor entirely comfortable, as if the building itself was watching, waiting to judge what was about to happen within its walls. Victor pulled open the heavy wooden doors, revealing an interior that was both beautiful and heartbreaking. Dust motes danced in the moonlight streaming through broken windows, and vandals had left their marks on walls that had once hosted wedding ceremonies and funeral services. But despite the decay, Sarah could feel that this place still held something sacred. "The altar," Victor said, pointing toward the front of the church. "That's where we'll settle this." As they walked down the center aisle, Sarah noticed that Victor's movement had become less fluid, more human. The consecrated ground was indeed affecting his supernatural abilities. "Tell me about your family," Victor said as they reached the altar area. "The ones who fought my kind in Romania." "I don't know much," Sarah admitted. "My grandfather died before he could pass on most of the knowledge. But from what I've learned, they weren't professional hunters or members of some secret organization. They were just ordinary people who refused to let monsters prey on their communities." "Ordinary people," Victor mused. "Yes, that's always been our greatest weakness. Not the priests with their holy water, not the scholars with their ancient knowledge, but ordinary people who simply refuse to surrender." He removed his jacket and rolled up his sleeves, preparing for combat. "One more question before we begin. If you somehow manage to kill me tonight, what then? Will you hunt down every vampire in existence? Will you become the monster you're fighting against?" Sarah thought about Marcus, about the choice he'd made to retain his humanity despite his transformation. "I'll protect people who need protection. I'll fight monsters who prey on the innocent." Beyond that, she shrugged. "I'll figure it out as I go." Victor smiled, and for a moment he looked almost human. "I believe you will. Very well, Sarah Martinez, descendant of vampire hunters. Let us discover what legacy your bloodline has left you." The fight that followed would determine not just their personal fate, but the future of everyone living in Detroit. In the abandoned church, surrounded by the remnants of faith and hope, two very different kinds of predator prepared to test their strength against each other. Sarah gripped her wooden stake in one hand and her grandfather's cross in the other, feeling the weight of generations of protectors who had fought similar battles in dark places throughout history. Victor assumed a combat stance that spoke of centuries of experience in killing, his eyes reflecting the moonlight like an animal's. And in the shadows beyond the altar, unseen by either combatant, other figures watched and waited to see which vision of Detroit's future would survive the night. The final stand. The abandoned church of St. Catherine held its breath as Sarah Martinez and Victor Castellane faced each other across the altar. Moonlight filtered through broken stained glass windows, casting fractured rainbows across the dusty pews where families had once gathered to worship. Now the sacred space would witness a different kind of prayer, the desperate plea of a human soul refusing to surrender to darkness. Victor moved first. Not with the supernatural speed Sarah had seen before, but with the calculated precision of a master swordsman. The consecrated ground was limiting his vampiric abilities, forcing him to rely on centuries of combat experience. His first strike was a testing blow, a quick jab toward Sarah's midsection that she barely managed to deflect with her wooden stake. The impact sent vibrations up her arm, and she realized immediately that even diminished Victor possessed strength far beyond any human opponent she'd ever faced. "Excellent reflexes," Victor commented, already repositioning for his next attack. "Your grandfather taught his family well, even if he didn't live to complete your training." Sarah didn't waste energy on a response. She'd learned during their first encounter that Victor enjoyed psychological warfare as much as physical combat. Instead, she focused on the lessons she'd absorbed from Father Rodriguez's journal and Elena's translations of ancient hunting techniques. The key, according to the old texts, was not to match a vampire's strength or speed, but to use faith and determination to create opportunities for decisive strikes. The wooden stake wasn't just a weapon, it was a symbol of humanity's refusal to become prey. Victor's second attack came as a combination, a feint to the left followed by a genuine strike toward her heart. Era spun away from the first movement and brought her grandfather's cross up to block the second. The silver surface flared with warm light as it made contact with Victor's hand, and he hissed in pain as his flesh burned. "Still don't understand how that trinket works," Victor muttered, flexing his singed fingers. "It's not the trinket," Sarah said, pressing her advantage by advancing with the cross held forward. "It's the faith behind it. Generations of people who believed that evil could be fought and defeated." Victor retreated several steps, but his expression was calculating rather than fearful. Faith, he mused. Such a fragile foundation for power. "Tell me, Sarah, what happens when your faith wavers? When you realize that good people sometimes do terrible things, and terrible people sometimes show mercy?" As he spoke, he moved sideways along the altar rail, forcing Sarah to turn and potentially lose sight of the church's other entrances. She realized he was still fighting tactically, using conversation to mask strategic positioning. "I've already seen good people do terrible things," Sarah replied, thinking of Marcus's transformation and the hunger that had nearly consumed him. "It doesn't change the fundamental choice between protecting innocence and preying on it." Then he vaulted over the altar rail with fluid grace, landing directly in front of Sarah before she could react. His hand closed around her throat, lifting her off the ground with terrifying ease. Even weakened by the consecrated ground, his strength was overwhelming. Sarah felt her vision beginning to gray as her air supply was cut off, but her training kicked in. Not formal combat instruction, but the street-smart survival instincts she developed growing up in Detroit's roughest neighborhoods. Instead of trying to pull Victor's hand away from her throat, she drove the wooden stake toward his chest. Victor was forced to release her to avoid the blow, and Sarah dropped to her knees, gasping for air. She rolled away as his foot slammed into the floor where her head had been moments before. "Better," Victor acknowledged. "You're learning to think like a hunter rather than a victim." Sarah got back to her feet, noting that the exertion was affecting Victor more than he wanted to admit. His pale skin showed a light sheen of perspiration, and his breathing was slightly labored. The consecrated ground was taking a toll on his supernatural constitution. "Getting tired?" she asked, raising the cross between them again. Victor's laugh was genuine. "My dear girl, I've been fighting for longer than your country has existed. This is barely a warm-up exercise." But his boast was undermined by the way he favored his left side, and Sarah realized that her earlier stake thrust had come closer to connecting than she'd thought. A thin line of dark blood stained his white shirt just below his ribs. The smell of Victor's blood triggered something unexpected in the church around them. The shadows seemed to deepen and shift, and Sarah heard movement from the areas beyond the altar. Not vampires, but something else entirely. "Do you feel that?" Victor asked quietly, his confident demeanor cracking slightly. Sarah did feel it, a presence that was both ancient and benevolent, as if the church itself was awakening to judge the conflict taking place within its walls. The air grew thick with the weight of countless prayers that had been offered in this space, the accumulated faith of generations of worshippers. "This place remembers," Sarah said, understanding flooding through her. "It remembers what it was built for, to be a sanctuary against evil." Victor's eyes darted nervously around the church interior. "Impossible. It's been abandoned for decades. Consecrated ground loses its power when faith departs." "But faith hasn't departed," Sarah replied, feeling strength flowing into her from sources she couldn't fully comprehend. "It's sleeping, waiting for someone to call it awake." She raised her grandfather's cross higher, and its silver surface began to emit a soft, steady light. The illumination spread outward, revealing details of the church that had been hidden in shadow. Faded paintings on the walls depicted saints and angels, their faces serene but determined. Carved figures on the surviving pews showed scenes of protection and salvation. Victor backed away from the expanding circle of light, his confidence replaced by something approaching fear. "You don't understand what you're invoking," he warned. "Sacred power isn't something mortals can control safely. It burns through human vessels, consuming them as thoroughly as any vampire's hunger." Sarah felt the truth in his words. The power flowing through her was vast and ancient, far beyond her ability to fully contain or direct. But she also sensed that it was responding to her will, because her motivations were pure. She wasn't seeking power for its own sake, but as a tool to protect others. "Then I guess I'll have to trust it to know when to stop," she said. Victor snarled and launched himself forward, abandoning caution for a desperate all-out assault. His claws extended as he flew towards Sarah, aiming to end the fight before the sacred power could build to levels that might actually threaten his existence. Sarah didn't try to dodge. Instead, she stepped into his attack, bringing the wooden stake up in a precise thrust while simultaneously pressing the silver cross against Victor's chest. The impact was explosive. The cross's light flared to blinding intensity as it made contact with Victor's heart, while the wooden stake punched through his ribcage with surprising ease. Victor screamed, not in pain, but in rage and disbelief that a mortal could have outmaneuvered him. But the stake, while accurate, hadn't been driven deep enough to reach his heart. Victor twisted away, the wooden point tearing free from his chest, and staggered backward toward the church's main entrance. "This isn't over," he gasped, blood streaming from the wound in his chest. "You may have won tonight, but I have resources you can't imagine. Allies who will come looking for me." "Let them come," Sarah replied, though she was swaying on her feet from exhaustion. The sacred power was already fading, leaving her feeling drained and hollow. Victor looked at her for a long moment, and she saw something like respect in his ancient eyes. "You really would face them all, wouldn't you? One human against an army of darkness, if I had to. Then you're either the bravest person I've ever met, or the most foolish." Victor pressed a hand to his bleeding chest, perhaps both. As he turned toward the exit, Sarah called after him. "What about our deal? You leave Detroit alone?" Victor paused at the church doors. "A deal is a deal. My children and I will depart this city by tomorrow night." But Sarah, he looked back at her one final time. "This victory came at a price. Using sacred power as you did tonight has marked you. Other creatures of darkness will sense what you've done, what you've become. They'll seek you out, either to test themselves against you or to eliminate you before you become too strong." "What do you mean, what I've become?" But Victor was already gone, disappearing into the Detroit night like smoke dissolving in the wind. Sarah sank onto one of the surviving pews, her legs too shaky to support her weight any longer. The wooden stake fell from her nerveless fingers, and she had to grip her grandfather's cross with both hands to keep from dropping it as well. The church around her was quiet again, the ancient presence that had awakened to help her settling back into dormancy. But she could still feel something different about herself, a warmth in her chest that hadn't been there before, a sense of connection to something larger and more powerful than her individual will. Her radio crackled with David's voice. "Sarah? Sarah, respond!" I heard screaming, and then there was this light. "I'm here," she said into the radio. "It's over. Victor's gone. Are you injured?" Sarah took inventory of her condition. Bruises on her throat from where Victor had grabbed her, scratched and scraped hands from the fight, exhaustion that went bone deep, but nothing that wouldn't heal. "I'm okay. Meet me at the church entrance in 5 minutes." As she made her way toward the doors, Sarah noticed something that made her pause. The stained glass windows, which had been broken and covered with plywood when she entered, were now intact. Not new, but whole, as if the battle had somehow restored them to their original state. More unsettling was her reflection in one of the windows. She looked the same as always. Brown hair, determined brown eyes. The face of a Detroit security guard who'd never expected to become a vampire hunter. But there was something different in her expression, a depth that hadn't been there before. Victor had been right. She'd been changed by what happened in the church, marked in ways she didn't yet understand. David was waiting outside when she emerged, along with Marcus, who looked pale and shaken. "I felt it," Marcus said immediately. "Whatever happened in there, every vampire in the city felt it. They're scared, Sarah, terrified of what you've become." "What have I become?" Marcus shook his head. "I don't know, but I can sense power in you now, something that makes my vampire instincts want to either flee or submit. It's like you're carrying a piece of the divine." David looked between them with the expression of someone whose worldview had been fundamentally shaken. "So it's true. All of it. Vampires, sacred power, supernatural battles in abandoned churches. You don't have to believe it," Sarah said. "Most people will go their entire lives without seeing anything like this. But I did see it. The light from the church was visible for blocks, and there were witnesses, homeless people, late-night workers, security cameras. By morning, there will be videos on the internet and reports on the news." She'd been focused on the immediate threat of Victor and his vampires, not on the broader implications of using sacred power in the middle of a major city. "What do we do?" she asked. David was quiet for a moment, thinking. "We control the narrative. I can make sure the official police report describes it as an electrical phenomenon, maybe damaged power lines creating unusual lighting effects. The witnesses, most people will assume they saw something explainable, especially if that's what the authorities tell them. And if other supernatural threats come looking for me, like Victor warned, then we'll deal with them," Marcus said firmly. "I may not be human anymore, but I remember who I am and what I believe in. If you're willing to fight monsters, I'll fight beside you." David nodded. "And I'll make sure you have whatever resources the police department can provide without asking too many awkward questions." Standing outside the church in the pre-dawn hours, Sarah realized that her life had changed irrevocably. She was no longer just a security guard from Detroit's East Side. She was something new, a guardian marked by divine power, a hunter called to stand against darkness. The responsibility was terrifying, but it also felt right. Growing up in Detroit had taught her that someone had to stand up to bullies and predators, that communities survived only when people were willing to protect each other. Now, her community had expanded to include anyone threatened by supernatural evil, and she had tools and allies she'd never expected to possess. "So what's our next move?" David asked. Sarah looked back at the church, where stained glass windows caught the first rays of dawn and transformed them into rainbow patterns of light and hope. "We learn," she said. "We prepare. We find other people like us who are willing to fight, and we make sure that when the next Victor Castellane comes to Detroit, we're ready for him." As they walked back to David's police car, Sarah felt the weight of her grandfather's cross against her chest. But now it was accompanied by something else, a sense of purpose that went beyond personal survival or even protecting her immediate community. Marcus had been right about one thing. She'd been marked by what happened in the church, changed in ways that would draw other supernatural threats to her. But she'd also been given gifts, power, allies, and most importantly, the knowledge that ordinary people could stand against extraordinary evil and win. Detroit was safe from Victor's vampires, at least for now. But somewhere in the darkness, other monsters were already beginning to take notice of the light that had blazed from St. Catherine's Church and the woman who had wielded it. The real war was just beginning, and Sarah Martinez, vampire hunter, protector of the innocent, and bearer of divine fire, was ready to fight it. 6 months later, Sarah stood in her apartment, which had been transformed into a combination research center and armory. Books on supernatural creatures covered every available surface. Maps of Detroit marked with suspicious incident locations papered the walls, and a locked gun safe contained weapons blessed by priests from a dozen different denominations. Elena Santos had become her full-time research partner, using her library connections to track down rare texts and historical accounts of monster encounters. David had formed an unofficial supernatural crimes unit within the Detroit Police Department, staffed by officers who'd proven able to handle the truth about what lurked in their city's shadows. Marcus had found his calling as well, using his vampire senses to detect supernatural threats while maintaining his humanity through sheer force of will. He'd become Sarah's early warning system, able to sense approaching dangers long before they became visible to normal human perception. And the threats had come, just as Victor had predicted, a pack of werewolves drawn by reports of Detroit's vampire hunter. A coven of witches seeking to claim territory in a city where supernatural activity was increasing, ancient spirits awakened by the growing supernatural energy and seeking to reclaim places of power. Each encounter had tested Sarah's growing abilities and expanded her understanding of the hidden world that existed alongside ordinary human society. She'd learned to channel sacred power more safely, discovered that her family's legacy included more than just vampire hunting, and built a network of allies that extended far beyond Detroit. The stained glass window from St. Catherine's Church now hung in her living room, removed when the building was finally demolished to make way for urban renewal. But its true significance wasn't decorative. It served as a focal point for the sacred energy that had marked Sarah that night, a reminder of the moment when she'd chosen to become something more than human. As she prepared for another night's patrol, Sarah thought about Victor's final words to her. He'd asked what she'd become, and at the time, she hadn't known how to answer. Now she did. She'd become exactly what the world needed, a guardian standing at the boundary between light and darkness, protecting those who couldn't protect themselves from threats they'd never imagined. And in a city like Detroit, where hope and determination had always been the difference between survival and surrender, that was exactly the kind of hero the people deserved. The hunt continued,